Somewhere on your tomato plant, right now, there's a small shoot pushing out in the crook where a branch meets the main stem. Most gardeners pinch it off and let it drop in the dirt without a second thought. That little piece you're tossing is the richest, most active tissue on the whole plant, and it carries almost everything the plant would need to feed its next round of growth. In the next few minutes, I'll show you how to turn a handful of those trimmings into a liquid feed you can pour this weekend using what you were about to throw away. I'll also show you the one ingredient that nearly every version of this recipe tells you to add to keep it safe, and why the research quietly points the other direction. Let's start with what's already in your hand. Here's the part the quick videos skip right past. When a tomato plant pulls nitrogen, potassium, and a long list of trace minerals up out of the soil, it doesn't spread them evenly through its body. It moves the ones it can carry toward the young, growing tips, because that's where the building happens. The sucker, that shoot you pinch, is one of those growing tips. So when you cut it, you are not holding garden scrap. You are holding a concentrated sample of exactly what this plant, in this soil, decided it needed most. Soak it in water, let the right microbes take it apart, and you can hand those same nutrients back to the roots in a form they drink up in days. That's the whole idea, and it's a good one. A closed loop, tuned to your own plant, instead of a bag of numbers you bought on a guess. Growers have leaned on plant-based feeds like this for generations, long before there was a fertilizer aisle to walk down. You might wonder why we bother soaking the trimmings at all. Why not just bury them and let the soil sort it out? You can, and in time the soil will. But there's a reason the liquid version works so much faster, and it's worth understanding, because once you get it, the whole method makes sense. Most of the nitrogen in a fresh green leaf is locked up inside proteins, and roots cannot drink protein. Before the plant can use that nitrogen, microbes have to take those proteins apart and release the nitrogen in a simple, soluble form, the kind roots absorb almost at once. That conversion is the entire job of the ferment. You're not really making fertilizer so much as hiring a crew of microbes to unlock the fertilizer that was already sitting inside the leaf. Bury a leaf, and that same process still happens, just slowly, over weeks, out of sight. Soak it with a scoop of compost and you gather the crew and the raw material together in one warm, wet place, and the unlocking happens in days instead. That's why a plant that had stalled can turn a corner so quickly. You handed it nutrients that were already broken down and ready to go. Before you brew anything, spend 30 seconds reading the plant, because the best gardeners feed on evidence, not on a calendar. A tomato will tell you when it's hungry, if you know where to look. The clearest sign of nitrogen hunger shows up on the oldest leaves first, down low on the plant. They fade from green to pale, sometimes to yellow, while the top of the plant still looks fine. That pattern is the plant doing triage, pulling nitrogen out of its old leaves to keep the new ones going. When you see that, a nitrogen-rich feed like this one is exactly the right answer. Two other hungers are worth learning to spot. When the older, lower leaves develop dry, scorched, brown edges while the center stays green, that often points to a potassium shortage, and potassium is the fruiting nutrient. So that's a cue to lean toward a higher potassium feed rather than this one. And when a plant looks stunted and dull, with a purple cast creeping up the undersides of the leaves and stems, that can point to phosphorus, especially in cold, early-season soil. You don't have to memorize a chart. You just have to notice that not all hunger looks the same and match the feed to the sign. Because here's the trap on the other side. If your plant is already deep green, lush, and growing hard, it is not asking for more nitrogen. Feed it anyway and you get a tall, leafy plant and a thin harvest. Reading first is what keeps you from solving a problem you don't actually have. Hungry and greedy look different, and telling them apart is half the skill. You may already be removing suckers for better airflow and better fruit. A lot of experienced tomato growers do it as a matter of course. If that's you, you've been carrying your best feedstock to the compost pile and stopping one step short. The reason suckers work so well is simple. Soft, green, fast-growing tissue breaks down quickly and releases its nitrogen fast, which is exactly what you want in a liquid feed. Older, tougher leaves work too. They just take a little longer. Now the one rule, and it matters more than anything else in this video. Only ever cut from a plant that looks healthy. If a plant shows mottled or streaky leaves, puckered new growth, or spots ringed like a target, leave it out completely. Here's why that rule is not optional. Some of the worst tomato troubles, the mosaic viruses and the common blights, live right in the foliage, and a few of them are remarkably tough. Tobacco mosaic virus has stayed infectious in dried plant material for decades. A bucket of water sitting on your patio never gets hot enough to kill it. The studies that do knock it out use sustained heat well above 140 degrees Fahrenheit for days, the kind of heat you only reach deep inside a hot, managed compost pile, never in a cool, steeping bucket. This is why extension programs in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Florida all say the same thing about diseased tomato plants. Don't compost them, don't recycle them, bag them, or burn them. Steeping sick leaves and pouring them back over your tomatoes is the one way to take a helpful habit and turn it into a way to spread trouble across your whole bed. Healthy material in, healthy feed out. That single rule keeps you safe through everything that follows. Trimmings on their own will break down, slowly. What speeds it up and makes the feed noticeably better is a scoop of finished compost. Not mainly for its nutrients, but for its life. Good compost is full of the microbes that do the real work of taking plant tissue apart and turning it into something roots can use. A handful is really a starter culture, the way a spoonful of old dough gets the next loaf going. And here's a distinction worth keeping straight, because a lot of channels blur it. The fungi you see in a compost pile, those fine white threads, are decomposers. They break down dead material, and that is exactly what you want in your bucket. They are not the same as the mycorrhizal fungi that partner with living roots out in the garden. Different organisms, different jobs. Your ferment is a decomposition project, and compost brings the crew that does it. One more thing about the water, and it trips up more people than you'd expect. If you fill your bucket straight from the tap, the chlorine or chloramine in most city water can knock back the very microbes you're trying to grow. Let the water sit out overnight so it can off-gas or use collected rainwater, and you sidestep the problem entirely. It costs you nothing but a little patience. Now the ingredient I promised you at the start. Almost every version of this recipe tells you to stir in molasses, and the reason usually given is that it keeps the mixture safe or balanced. The research tells a very different story, and this is the part I'd want a friend to hear before they made a batch. Molasses is sugar, and sugar feeds whatever is in the bucket, including the organisms you do not want. United States Department of Agriculture scientists David Ingram and Patricia Milner studied these compost brews closely and found that adding molasses could let human pathogens, the E. coli and salmonella kind, multiply from almost nothing up to serious numbers. And the more sugar they added, the worse it got. When they left the molasses out, or kept it to a trace, that regrowth simply didn't happen. It mattered enough that a National Organic Standards panel singled out sugar additives as the deciding factor in whether these brews grow the bacteria that make people sick. That is not a fringe worry. That is the official caution. So here's the honest version. A tiny pinch of molasses to wake the microbes up won't hurt. But here's the freeing part. You can skip it entirely and lose almost nothing, because the scoop of compost already brought every microbe your bucket needs. The sugar was never really the point. It was a habit passed from one recipe to the next, and it's the one habit here that carries a real downside. And whatever you do, keep a sugar-fed brew off the parts of the plant you're going to eat, especially close to harvest. Pour it on the soil, never on the fruit. That one adjustment is the whole difference between a feed that helps you and one you'd never want near your dinner. There's not a lot of profit in telling you the safest recipe is also the cheapest and the simplest. But in the garden, that's usually exactly how it goes. I pulled all of this, the ratios, the timing, the safe material rule, and the little things that quietly go wrong onto a single page you can keep by the shed door. Point your phone at the code on your screen and it's yours to download. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then come right back, because the next stretch is where most people either get this right or waste 2 good weeks. Here's how it comes together. Loosely fill your container somewhere between 1/3 and halfway with trimmings, add your scoop of compost, and top it off with your dechlorinated water. Use a bucket with a loose lid or a cloth over the top, never sealed tight. The mixture needs to breathe. Set it out of direct sun so it doesn't cook or dry down, and then you wait, usually 1 to 2 weeks. Warmth speeds everything along, so a batch in high summer may be ready closer to 1 week, while a cool spell can stretch it toward 2 or 3. As it works, the liquid darkens to a deep green brown. That color change is your signal that the nutrients have moved out of the leaves and into the water. Now let's talk about smell, because you were probably told a strong odor means it's working. That's only half true. A ferment that's breathing, one you stir every day or two so air gets in, smells earthy, a little yeasty, alive. A ferment that's gone still and airless turns sour and sulfurous, like rotten eggs. That second smell is not strength. It's a warning that the wrong microbes have taken over. If you get that rotten smell, you have 2 choices. Stir it hard, give it air for a couple of days, and it may well come back. If it's truly foul, pour it out and start fresh. A quick daily stir is the cheapest insurance there is. Trust your nose here. It's a better test than any chart I could give you. When your 2 weeks are up, do not pour that concentrate straight onto your plants. At full strength, it's simply too much, too salty and too sharp with ammonia, and it can burn the fine feeder roots you're trying to help. The fix is easy. 1 part of your ferment to 10 parts clean water until it looks like weak tea. That ratio isn't fussiness. It's the line between feeding your plant and shocking it. When you're unsure, go weaker rather than stronger. You can always feed again next week. You cannot unburn a root. Once your plant is genuinely growing and taking the feed well, this diluted mix works about every 1 to 2 weeks. Not every day, and not every time you walk past with the watering can. More is not better here. It's just a faster road to trouble. A good soak around the base, enough to reach the root zone, is plenty. And make it fresh. Mix only what you'll use, and pour it within a day or so, rather than letting the watered-down version sit around. Keep the concentrate loosely covered so it can breathe between feedings. Think of it as cooking, not canning. It's best served fresh. 1 small habit prevents a lot of trouble. If the soil is bone dry, water the plant with plain water first, then follow with the feed. Nutrients hitting dry roots are far more likely to burn than nutrients going into already moist soil. And if you remember only 1 number from all of this, remember 1 to 10, and remember to go lighter, not heavier, whenever you're in doubt. Pour your diluted feed at the base of the plant, onto the soil, where the roots can take it up. Resist the urge to spray it over the leaves. On a plant you're going to eat, a soil drench is the safer and the smarter choice. It keeps the feed where it's useful, and it keeps it off the fruit. This is the same logic as the molasses rule, and it's worth making a habit of the phrase, feed the soil, not the salad. None of this is difficult, but a working bucket of fermenting plant matter deserves a little respect. Keep it where children and pets don't wander, both for the smell and because, as we just saw, the wrong microbes can move in if you're careless. Stir it with a dedicated stick, not your good kitchen spoon, and wash your hands afterward, the same way you would after turning a compost pile. When you use it, aim it at the soil around your fruiting plants, and be extra careful with low, leafy crops you eat raw, like lettuce or spinach, especially in the last few weeks before you pick. Feeding the soil weeks ahead of harvest is one thing. Splashing a raw brew on something you'll eat tomorrow is another. A little care here costs you nothing, and it keeps this squarely on the side of good, honest gardening. Here's the piece that turns a decent gardener into a really good one. This feed, made from green tomato tops, runs high in nitrogen. Nitrogen is the growth signal. It's wonderful for a young plant building leaves and frame in early summer. But once your plant starts flowering and setting fruit, that very same signal starts to work against you. Flood a fruiting tomato with nitrogen and it does exactly what you told it to do. It grows more leaves and holds back on tomatoes, tall, green, and disappointing. This is where an old name is worth knowing. Lawrence Hills was an English gardener who spent much of his life studying homegrown plant feeds and founded a research group to do it properly. He championed a different plant for this job, comfrey, precisely because comfrey tea runs high in potassium, the nutrient that supports flowers and fruit rather than leaves. 2 plant teas, 2 very different jobs. If you'd like a second free source of nitrogen for those early weeks, a bucket of stinging nettles steeped the very same way does the same work. Nettle for the leafy stage, comfrey for the fruiting stage. That's the old allotment pairing, and your tomato trimmings sit right alongside the nettle. So think of it this way. Your nitrogen-rich tomato trimming feed is a spring and early summer tool for young plants finding their feet. As the fruit begins to set, ease off it and lean toward higher potassium feeds instead. Same simple bucket habit, the right nutrient at the right moment. That's the timing almost nobody mentions, and it's the whole difference between growing a green thicket and growing a crop of tomatoes. I want to be fair with you about where this belongs. A homemade feed like this is a wonderful complement to healthy soil. It is not a replacement for it. If your beds are genuinely worn out, the most useful thing you can do is still the least glamorous one, building the soil itself with compost and organic matter over time. And if you're chasing down a stubborn problem, a simple soil test will tell you more than any brew ever could. So think of this feed as a quick, gentle, nearly free top-up you can give a growing plant in between those bigger, slower improvements. Used that way, in season, on a plant that actually wants it, it earns its place many times over. Treat it as a cure for everything. It would just be one more promise the garden can't keep, and there are already plenty of those going around. So you've poured it. What should you honestly expect by next week? On a plant that was truly hungry, one that looked pale and stalled, you can see a real answer within days. Deeper green in the leaves, new growth picking back up, a plant that looks like it finally exhaled. A liquid feed is available to the roots quickly, faster than anything dry you dig in, so that quick response is real, not a sales line. But let me be straight with you about what it will not do, because that honesty is the whole reason this channel exists. It won't rescue a plant that isn't actually short on nutrients. Feeding a plant that isn't hungry just pushes soft, floppy growth that pests love. It won't cure a disease, and it won't fix blossom end rot, that sunken brown patch on the bottom of the fruit. That one is almost always a watering problem, the plant failing to move calcium during dry then wet swings, not something you can pour back in with another feed. And a gentle word on flavor, since so many videos love to promise it. A well-fed, healthy plant does tend to carry and ripen its fruit better, so feeding helps. But the taste of a tomato is written mostly by sunlight, steady water, and the variety you chose to plant. No feed turns a watery supermarket type into a summer heirloom. Feed for a healthy plant, and let the sun and the seed do the rest. Knowing what a thing can't do is exactly what lets you trust it for what it can. Your garden has been handing you the makings of its own fertilizer all season long, in the very trimmings you were about to throw away. Give it clean material, a little air, and the right week to pour, and it tends to hand back far more than you ever put in.